Well, joining me now is one of the leading architects of the Voice to Parliament proposal and a director of the Cape York Partnership, Noel Pearson. Noel Pearson, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I thought I might open up by asking you
Good morning, Andrew.
In the simplest terms possible, why should Australians vote for this change in the Constitution?
This change will recognise for the first time in our national document Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples of Australia. It will do that by authorising the federal parliament to create a voice, to create a body representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to give their views to the parliament about laws that are made by the parliament in respect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the second thing the body will do, it will advise the executive government of the day of the policies and programs that government administers on behalf of Indigenous people.
You've come a long way through this process. You're involved in pulling together the original Uluru Statement of the Heart. You're involved in the Kem Wyatt working group on the Voice proposal under the Coalition and the most recent working group on the words of this referendum question. Has it ever occurred to you during this time that it might be a better and easier course of action to go for constitutional recognition first, to get the bipartisan support for that, and then perhaps to move for a voice? Why were you so insistent a voice had to happen within the Constitution as opposed to legislation?
Well, firstly, Andrew, the history goes back a bit further than you've outlined there. The history starts with John Howard. John Howard and I had meetings in 2007 about constitutional recognition. And I wrote a long letter to him arguing the case. We had meetings and I made an argument. I made a political argument to John saying, you're heading to your last election, and if you win, you'll be in your last term. I think now is the time to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. And over the course of that dialogue, Mr. Howard agreed that he would take to the 2007 election a platform commitment on behalf of the Liberal Party that within 18 months of the election, he would take a referendum to the Australian people for constitutional recognition. Now, of course, he didn't win in 2007, but it was that initiative on the part of Prime Minister John Howard that got the whole ball of constitutional recognition happening. And the voice is just the means by which the recognition is reflected. You could think of different ways of recognising Indigenous people, and voice is where Indigenous people landed eventually after a 10-year process, 2007 to 2017 at Uluru. Where we ended up was with the voice. But there were other ideas that were proposed earlier in the process, including ideas that were strongly rejected by constitutional conservatives in Australia. So when we got that initial rejection, we kept going back to the whiteboard, and eventually the idea that was settled in 2014 as a proposal with constitutional conservatives on board, with constitutional conservatives actually drafting the provision, Professor Craven, Professor Anne Toomey, they were involved, Julian Lisa was involved, and that proposal was to create an advisory body to the Parliament. And that's where we're at now.
All right. Well, what if this thing is set up? What if the referendum's successful? It's enshrined permanently in the Constitution, And it hardly changes a thing when it comes to the situation with Aboriginal people in this country, when it comes to low mortality rates, when it comes to issues of child protection, when it comes to the disadvantage Aboriginal people find themselves in. What do we do then? Because it's here permanently then.
Okay. Yeah, there's two aspects to that question. One is, firstly, the actual provision says the Parliament decides. In other words, the Parliament legislates to create the voice, what functions it has, what powers it has, how representation happens. All of that is up to the Parliament of the day. Gives complete power to our elected representatives in Canberra to decide what the voice looks like. And if next year they want to change it slightly, they can pass legislation to change it. If they want to replace it with a totally different structure, they will have the power to do that. So everything lies in the hands of the Parliament. Second thing, will it make a difference? Well, you know, we've had 26 years since 1996, and the coalition has been in power for 21 of those 26 years. We've had coalition governments in charge of Indigenous affairs, and we haven't made progress, Andrew. Now, they can't turn around now and say, well, let's keep going as we have been going for the last 26 years and hope that we can see improvements with child protection, with incarceration of adults, with juvenile detention, with health and education and so on. That's not a sustainable, and that is not an honest position to take.
All right.
Come on.
What happens?
We've had 26 years for the current system to work.
What happens if you end up with a just falling over the line? 51-49, 52-48. I mean, Peter Dutton argues that will divide Australia. That would be pretty divisive, wouldn't it? You want a better result than that.
No. Our national document sets the rules for referendum change, and it says we need a majority of voters, that is a majority of Australians, in a majority of the states. So the bar for changing it is actually harder than a federal election. A federal election just requires you to have 51% of all Australians. But the Constitution says that if you want to change the words of the Constitution, you also need a majority of voters in a majority of the states. So a small state like Tasmania, you've got to get a majority there, and you've got to get a majority in Western Australia, and so on. Out of the 6 states, you need 4 of them to say yes. So that's a very high hurdle.
All right.
And if we get that hurdle, it will be legitimate.
All right, how would the group work? Give us a few examples. Would it advise a federal cabinet in the lead up to a budget on a rise in job seeker, for example? That affects Aboriginal people. Can you give us a few examples about how you see the voice working?
Well, firstly, it's got to work at the local level. It's got to work at the level of Yuendumu. It's got to work at the level of Hopevale, where I come from. It's got to enable those communities to sit down with the Commonwealth government and hopefully with the state government as well and the local government. And we need to make deals. They need to make deals about the football oval, about the housing situation, about the children not attending school, about the curfew hours for children roaming around the streets. They make decisions about the initiatives they're going to take to address those problems. And the thing is, it's going to give solutions for the communities at the local level. Finally, we're going to have bureaucrats representing the government sitting down at the community level and tackling those problems. And at a regional levels, such as the level...
What about nationally?
At the national level, you need to tackle the laws that Parliament's making, because laws are very important. They allow things to happen on the ground. And at a national level, legislation might come up, such as cultural heritage, dealing with the the fallout from the Jukan Gorge case. Now, Jukan Gorge is a very important case study when we think about the voice,
all right.
because protection was available. What we didn't have was the ability to tell Susan Ley as the minister, to give her, the TOs could give her the advice that, listen, we're very concerned that our site is going to be blown up here. Can you exercise your power?
Understand and appreciate that. But I just want to ask, because I want some clarity on this. What about broader issues that affect the entire community but also affect Indigenous people? Those issues are more related to Indigenous people. What about a job seeker rise or something like that? Do you see that as something the Voice would advise on?
Oh, the Voice will provide advice on that, along with everybody else's advice.
Okay.
And guess who gets to decide what weight to give it? It's our elected representatives.
Indeed.
They're the ones who decide, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. That's how it'll work.
All right. Do you see yourself being on the body?
No, I've been working very hard to set up a system for the future. We've got so many talented young leaders coming behind us. They're the ones who are going to make this system work into the future. And I see over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to start to close the gap. Because this is the mechanism we need. It's just one part of the mechanism, but it's the most crucial part, because getting the Parliament to work in cooperation with us, getting the executive government to work with us on a day-to-day basis, that's the key. But over the next 10, 20, 30 years, you'll see a gradual narrowing of the gap.
Well, we hope so.
And Indigenous is...
Sorry, Mr. Pearson, you pushed hard for executive government to remain, in the words as I understand it, behind the scenes. Why was it so important in your eyes that remained in the question as opposed to Parliament, which some like Julie and Lisa are now advocating for? Okay, so, by the way, Julie and Lisa now supports the provision with the executive in it. It's important that we get the executive in the scope, because that's a day-to-day business. That's day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month. The law function, advising on legislation, that's a once-in-a-blue-moon exercise. I don't think there's been an Indigenous relevant law passed in the Parliament for many, many years. Sometimes you can go 10 years without a new law. Understandably, right? You can't be passing a law about blackfellas every 6 months. That only happens in a blue moon. The important business here is the executive business of the government, because that's got to do with programs, that's got to do with policies, that's got to do with action on the ground. All of those things concern the executive government. All right. And there was a tweak done, actually. There was a tweak done by Albanese and my Indigenous colleagues. They tweaked the provision just before it was tabled in the Parliament to make it very clear that the Parliament can legislate to define how the advice is provided to the executive. Sure, we're nearly out of time. I've just got a couple of quick questions. Peter Dutton said the Voice to Parliament will re-racialise Australia and create an Orwellian situation where some Australians are more equal than others. That was in his speech on the legislation. What's your reaction to that? I don't know, Andrew, if you've ever been to Cooktown or to Aurukun or Yuendumu or Darwin or Alice Springs, and you've seen any blackfellas on the streets there. Would you say that they're more equal than other Australians? Who could sustain an argument like that? And the disappointing thing about the position taken by Peter Dutton is that I met with him, I think, 2 or 3 times with Julie and Lisa. This was when Julian was the spokesman for Aboriginal Affairs. And at those meetings, Peter was very, very
clear in what he said to me. He said, I do not agree with the race argument. Don't take me to be making a race argument here. He did not. He assured me that he did not take the voice to be a racial proposition. But of course, since Julian's left the spokesperson role, he's come back. He's come back to make this completely dishonest argument about re-racialising the Constitution. That is not the position Peter took to me when Julie and Lisa was in the room. He was very anxious to assure me, in fact, that he wasn't making that argument. I think he's being a bit duplicitous now in talking about re-racialising the Constitution. He's taking a very different position to the positions he took in meetings with me.
Noel Pearson, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Andrew.